Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
The former U.S. Vice President Mike Pence taking a critical stance on President Trump's tariffs, writing in a Wall Street Journal op-ed in the past few months that since the president announced his Liberation Day tariffs, the only thing America has been liberated from is trillions of dollars in investments. I'm pleased to say the 48th Vice President of the United States, Mike Pence, joins us now for more. Mr. Vice President, good morning.
Good morning. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you for being here. I want to pick up on a question I know you've been exploring. What can 47 learn from 45? Let's start there and talk about trade.
Well, first off, I want to give President Trump all the credit in the world for a historic political comeback. But in that Republican primary, I was traveling as a candidate in 2023. I mostly heard people saying, we want to get back in the midst of the failed economic policies of the Biden administration. We want to get back to what the Trump-Pence administration was advancing. And so in the Wall Street Journal, I gave the president great credit, high marks for securing the border, for restoring morale and recruitment in our military, for taking the fight to the Houthis. Since then, we'll talk more later, I'm very encouraged about the strong stand that the president is taking on the world stage, particularly in the Middle East and in Eastern Europe. But what I wanted to call attention to was the policy toward tariffs was changed with Liberation Day. During our administration, we used tariffs and the threat of tariffs, principally focused on China, to leverage changes in behavior, but the objective was to essentially lower trade barriers and expand trade. And in this administration, I think what we saw several months ago, now it's paused again happily, is the kind of broad-based industrial policy that I think ultimately will harm the American economy, will harm American consumers. And so we've spoken out against it. We've tried to take a stand. What I like to say is free trade with free nations. Be tough on China, be tough on trade abusers, but have the objective of ultimately lowering trade barriers. And that's how America wins and prospers. That's how we won during our first term.
You've identified that change. What's your understanding of what's behind it? What's led that change?
Well, I think that what's changed is that I think the president feels, at least I perceive it. You know, sometimes I tell people I know President Trump better than his most ardent defenders. We served together for 4.5 years. We had a close working relationship. And I've said many times that President Trump is not an isolationist. He is someone deeply committed to free market capitalism. But for all of his career, he has been very sympathetic to protectionist thinking and philosophy. You can go back 30 years on YouTube and find Donald Trump saying the same things that President Trump is saying today. Now, he and I had many vigorous conversations during our 4 years about trade. I come from one of the leading exporting states in the country. What we make, we grow in Indiana, we sell to the world. But at the end of the day, I think what you're seeing is not different influences around President Trump. I think you're simply seeing him extending out into a philosophy of government and economics that he has long believed.
Were these impulses then there when during the first administration, and individuals like you maybe talked him out of it?
Well, I don't know that it was. I mean, there were a few times that I saw him change his mind on things, but I think it was more about priorities in the first term, to make sure that we passed the tax cuts, rolled back regulation, unleashed American energy. And we changed the national consensus on China, China with its years of trade abuses. And I played a leading role in articulating that in the early going. And I'm incredibly proud of that record and glad that at least the Biden administration didn't change the tariff policy toward China. But for me, it was more about It was more about driving toward free trade agreements. I had the privilege of announcing the beginning of a free trade agreement with UK in the city of London. We renegotiated a free trade agreement with South Korea that's back in the news this week with new tariff threats. And I was leading with my counterpart in Japan. I was actually tasked with leading a working group for a free trade agreement with Japan. So for us, it was we saw an expansion of trade and opening markets as a key part of American growth. Right now, I actually believe that President Trump is driving toward a long-term change in industrial policy in America, where he sees permanent unilateral trade tariff barriers as beneficial to America in the long term. And I, as a free market conservative, it's something I just don't embrace.
Can you do that and isolate China with the rest of the world on board at the same time?
Well, Anne-Marie, I think that's the right question Senator Phil Gramm we had on Capitol Hill with our foundation yesterday. Had over 100 staffers that came out to hear him. He had probably the best description of it. He said by going after all of the free nations that you're trading with, at the same time that you're trying to bring China farther along into opening markets and ending years of trade abuses. He said it's like dismissing your front line in a football game and expecting you're going to take on the other side. Look, we need Japan, we need South Korea, we need Australia, we need the EU to continue to bring the kind of economic pressure on China that I believe is all that President Xi and the Chinese Communist Party will respect. We saw some change. Remember that phase one trade deal in the early days of 2020? Most people have long since forgotten it. There were bigger stories that year by far. But we saw when we imposed those $250 billion in tariffs, the Chinese came to the table quickly and began negotiations. And I still believe that's the right approach, with free trade with free nations being the backstop.
Mr. Vice President, I want to pick out a line in that Wall Street Journal op-ed that John was mentioning that you wrote. Mr. Trump's proposed tariffs would be the largest peacetime hike in American history, harming consumers and driving inflation.
Right. President
Trump, his administration has been talking about they're not going to be inflationary, that the producers in other countries are going to absorb it. Right. Are you seeing evidence that that's not the case? Are you really concerned about what this does to the economy?
Well, I really am. And I understand that that's the debate right now. We haven't seen the inflation from Liberation Day. And I think there's several reasons to explain that. Number one is the tariff regime was paused and has now been paused again, and the markets are responding to that, and businesses are responding. Secondly, I got to tell you, the businesses I talk to as I travel around the country have been spending an awful lot of money on inventory right now. You know, there's an old saying that, where I come from, that, I was born in the morning, but not yesterday morning. So people say these tariffs are coming, so why don't we fill the warehouse right now? And I think that's wise. But at the end of the day, I also think that the president on Liberation Day talked about 25%, 50%, 70% tariffs on countries. And seeing some of these early frameworks that end up, like with the UK with 10%, there's a temptation to say, well, that's just 10%. And so I think that's the reason why that's why businesses have not adjusted prices yet. But if we have a unilateral tariff of 10% on the American economy of all imported goods, that's 4 times the average tariff today. And the reality is that I watch, I spent a lot of time in that cabinet room. I watched a little bit of the cabinet meeting this week. And I saw Secretary Bessent speaking very glowingly about the projection is $300 billion in tariff revenue this year. Well, tariffs are a tax, and American importers and businesses and ultimately consumers pay almost all of that. And so literally a week after we managed to extend the Trump-Pence tax cuts and prevent a $2,000 tax increase on working families, the administration is right now boasting of the fact that that the average American household is going to see about $3,000 increase in the cost of goods, because we're paying that. So that's why I referred to Liberation Day. I said could well be the largest peacetime tax hike in American history. We've been pushing back on that. I welcome the pauses, but I really do believe the antidote here is free trade with free nations. Tough on China, but continue to drive toward lowering trade barriers and non-tariff subsidies.
You referred to the inflation risk. The White House would also like this Federal Reserve to cut interest rates. You've been in the room a few times, I'm sure, talking about this Federal Reserve. How did the president end up with a Fed chair that he dislikes so much? How did that happen?
Well, I've been watching a lot of what the president's had to say about Jay Powell lately, and he did appoint him, so it's part of the awkward aspect here. Well, first, I think the President of the United States is fully entitled to express his opinion about both the Fed chair and about the Federal Reserve itself. I have long had great concerns about the dual mandate in the Federal Reserve. I think it confuses the issue. I mean, the Federal Reserve has for your viewers, has a dual mandate to protect the integrity of the dollar and achieve full employment. I think the Federal Reserve ought to just focus on the dollar. And I think that the hesitation that I have seen from the Fed chair and ostensibly the committee is that the uncertainty around these broad-based tariffs and the potential for inflation has slowed their intention and their earlier efforts at lowering rates. And so how the president got to where he considers the Federal Reserve Chairman to be worthy of the nickname "Too Late," I can't really testify, but to me, pushing back on the idea that what seems to be holding up the Federal Reserve. Although I read this morning that there's now more vigorous debate. I'm sure you've covered here on Bloomberg.
Yep.
On the committee. We may have a lowering of interest rates, which we certainly would welcome.
As you know, the president, one of his greatest strengths is to break the status quo and have very little respect for it. Are there limits to that? And is Fed independence an example of it?
Well, that's right. And I think, look, the president appoints the chairman of the Federal Reserve. And a careful study of American history shows I don't really accept that the Federal Reserve should be a completely separate agency, like a college of cardinals that we never refer to other than in respectful hush tones, John. I think the president ought to be able to express himself. Elected officials ought to be able to express themselves, because it's almost like that old saying about the Supreme Court, that justices do read the newspaper. And I expect that's also true of members of the Federal Reserve.
You have taken a balanced view on the current administration. You've been somewhat critical of trade. We've discussed that. Mm-hmm. I would say a ringing endorsement about their approach to the Middle East. So let's talk about that.
Yeah.
Where you were in your first term with the president, where he is in his second term, and what went wrong in between, from your standpoint, on the Middle East?
Well, I just think when Joe Biden returned to a policy of appeasement toward Iran, it really emboldened the enemies of Israel across the region. I traveled to Israel about 6 months after October 7th and saw what occurred there. And I would tell you, it's one of the things I'm probably most proud of in our administration. Not only did we change the national consensus on China, but we were probably the most pro-Israel administration since the reestablishment of the State of Israel in 1948. There's just simply no moving the American embassy to Jerusalem, recognizing the Golan Heights. These were all historic achievements that everyone told us would foment violence and discord across the Middle East. But again, another 2020 story that is long forgotten by many people is the Abraham Accords. I mean, we actually demonstrated that when you stand without, in an unwavering way with Israel, that I call our most cherished ally throughout our history, it sends a very clear signal that makes peace more possible, not less possible. We also isolated Iran as never before. We unleashed our military to take down the ISIS caliphate. And of course, the president made the decision to take down Qasem Soleimani, the head of the Iran Revolutionary Guard. All of that had Iran on its back heels. The Biden administration changed that, went back to the Obama approach of re-engaging with the mullahs in Tehran. I think they were emboldened. The violence that we saw, whether it be October 7th with Hamas, one of their patron groups, or the Houthis, all were a result. I've always believed that weakness arouses evil. But peace comes through strength, and the weakness of the Biden administration, I think, created the conditions for the mayhem that the new Trump administration inherited, and that's why I've been so encouraged to see the strong stand the president has taken with Israel. We publicly encouraged the use of American military assets. If Iran was not willing to dismantle their nuclear program, I believe it needed to be destroyed. And I commend the president for his decisive leadership and our incredible airmen who delivered those payloads.
You welcome those strikes on the Iranian nuclear facilities, but the president still talks about a deal with Iran. Do you think he'll do a deal at any cost?
Well, I hope not. I said in that Wall Street Journal piece that you cited, it was about 2 months ago, and one of my concerns, in addition to some of the tariff issues that we talked about, was that a lot of what we were hearing from the administration in the first 100 days sounded an awful lot like a new Iran nuclear deal. And we pushed back on that pretty hard. My hope is that the president, having seen both the run-up to the need for American action and also the response by the mullahs in Tehran, he'll keep his hand on the holster and look ultimately for achieving the objective that has been the stated U.S. policy through multiple administrations, that Iran can never be allowed to obtain a nuclear weapon or have a nuclear program of any kind.
When it comes to foreign policy, you've been very critical and hawkish on Russia. In the debate, when you were running with President Trump in the first term, you called Putin a small and bullying dictator. Why do you think Trump has only just started changing his tune when it comes to Vladimir Putin?
Well, I've never had any illusions about Vladimir Putin.
No, but President Trump has.
Well, that remains to be seen. I would tell you that, I was on the Foreign Affairs Committee when I was in the Congress. I've been a student of Vladimir Putin. He's never made a secret of his ambitions in Eastern Europe. It's something he's spoken about, written about. His aim has always been to reestablish the old Soviet sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. And I really do believe it was our administration in the Trump-Pence years that were the first to literally provide lethal aid to Ukraine. I think that's what discouraged Putin from crossing that border during those 4 years. I think it continues to be the only pathway toward peace today.
But forgive me, Mr. Vice President, to go back to Anne-Marie's question, what's changed? Because right now we've seen a president who's warned against Russia crossing certain red lines that Russia's crossed, and then the sanctions haven't come.
Right.
What do you think is going on?
Well, I'm hopeful that they will.
What makes you hopeful?
I am. I've seen some statements by my friend Senator Lindsey Graham, who just in the last few days said that the president told him to move the bill. And these new Russia sanctions, which are the secondary sanctions against people that are doing business with Russia, that are subsidizing the war effort by oil purchases and energy purchases, I think can be enormously impactful. But I would say that I've made it very clear my deep conviction is Vladimir Putin doesn't want peace. Vladimir Putin wants Ukraine. Despite the stops and starts that gave many of us concern, including that famous Oval Office meeting between the president and President Zelensky, who I came to know well, I sense that my old running mate is coming around to recognizing Putin's real intentions here. I mean, when I think that the clear irritation in the president's voice of having a conversation, and then to see some of the worst drone attacks launched in Kiev within a matter of hours is, I think, having its effect. But look, I just think that I was pleased that the president countermanded what had been a pause of aid to Ukraine last week, which I think was unfortunate wherever it originated. But I commend the president for reversing that decision. And my hope is when the Senate reconvenes that Senator Thune will put the Graham bill on the floor and put it on the president's desk. I think it's time. And it's my judgment. I've met Vladimir Putin. I've stood with him closer than I'm sitting next to you. I've told him things he didn't want to hear. And I think he is not a man who understands anything other than strength. This is a moment, I think, where it's in the interest of our country, it's in the interest of our allies in the region, and long-term peace in Eastern Europe for us to continue to provide military support to Ukraine, to put punishing sanctions on Russia until a just and lasting peace can be secured.
Mr. Vice President, appreciate your time, sir. Enjoyed the conversation.
Great.
It's good to see you. Thank you. The former Vice President of the United States there, Mike Pence.